I think we get comfort as CFOs in numbers. That's actually what makes us powerful to help the organization. It's also an Achilles heel at times, right? Because you forget that there are people and products and competitors. One of the worst things that can happen with a sales team to a customer is where the salesperson does not understand why the change is happening. And remember that the salesperson has just as deep a relationship with the customer as they do with the company. They work for the company, but the customer is how they make their living. What will happen? Customers might churn. Salespeople might feel like they can't achieve their quota and they'll leave. They might feel like the company's being unfair. Probably the most important theme is we are on the same team. If a sales team believes executives are right there with them, you're probably going to have a much better chance with managing change with the sales teams.
The number of publicly traded companies in 2000 was just under 8,000. Now we're below 4,000.
I do think why more companies go private is because they're not held to a standard that we should be held to as executives. I use rule of 40. It's not that 40 is the magic number. It's just you have to balance growth and profit, and you have to hold yourself accountable to run a good business. We're too tolerant of companies not running a good business in the public markets, and that I do think is a problem.
Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Welcome back to Run the Numbers. Today I'm joined by Ken Stillwell, CFO and COO of Pega Systems, someone who spent his career as a professional number two, the Robin to the CEO's Batman at multiple stops. Ken's had a front row seat to some of the hardest transformations in enterprise software and shares tactical advice from those journeys. One of the biggest, leading Pega through the shift from term licenses to ARR and ACV. That kind of move sounds strategic on paper, but in practice, it means rewiring sales comp, retraining muscle memory, and navigating every landmine that comes with changing how people get paid. We also get into how Ken approached that shift, where he pushed, where he paused, and what he learned about aligning go-to-market teams without derailing momentum. We also talk about his take on KPIs, specifically the danger in obsessing over them. Ken's not anti-metrics, but he makes a strong case that sometimes you need to just zoom out and ask the simpler question. Are we actually heading in the right direction? And we dig into a sharper distinction, public versus private. Ken's worked on both sides and argues that private equity works, in part, because public execs just aren't wired or incentivized to run lean, focused businesses. We unpack what that means and how he's tried to bring more discipline into a public operating environment without losing the ability to play long. All this and much, much more after a short word from our sponsors. This next segment is brought to you by Tabs, a company I've been following closely for quite a while. And if you're a CFO or controller listening, this is one you should pay attention to, because this is where billing and revenue automation is headed, especially in a world of usage-based pricing. Ali and the team at Tabs are building something that directly addresses one of the biggest headaches I see finance teams deal with today. Pulling data from your ERP, your CRM, your FP&A tools, and your usage systems and actually making it all work together. If you're running usage-based pricing or complex contracts, you already know how this usually plays out. Contracts live in one system, usage data lives somewhere else, billing happens in another tool. RevRec gets layered on top at month end, and finance ends up just reconciling everything by hand to close the books. It works for a while until close slows down, RevRec gets fragile, and wait for it, cash shows up later than it should. This is exactly the problem Tabs was built to solve. Tabs is an AI-native revenue platform built for controllers and CFOs. It brings together data from your ERP, CRM, and real product usage into a single system of record. From there, it automates billing, collections, and revenue recognition without finance having to duct tape workflows together every month. No CSV uploads, no manual reconciliations, no end-of-month fire drills. Companies like Cortex, StatSig, and Cursor are already using Tabs to scale revenue per employee, save hours every close, recognize revenue cleanly, and get paid faster. If usage-based revenue is core to your business, this is the future of how billing and RevRec get done. Go check them out at tabs.com/run. That's tabs.com/run. Now, if you listen to Run the Numbers, you know that I have a love-hate relationship with finance tech. We've all been burned. We've all bought that enterprise planning tool that promised the world, only to realize 6 months later that we've basically taken on a second full-time job just to keep the software running. I want to talk about a company that was built specifically to kill that cycle, Abacum. I actually remember my very first conversation with their founder and CEO, Julio Martinez, over 3 years ago. Back then, they were just starting out in Spain. What struck me most was his frustration with these massive legacy planning platforms that had long implementations, expensive consultants, and after all that work, you're still struggling to get answers and manage the system. He and his co-founder Jorge are both former CFOs. I knew I liked those guys. Fast forward to today, Julio moved the home base to NYC. They've raised over $100 million in capital from heavy hitters like Scale Venture Partners, and they're the engine behind finance teams at Strava, Replit, and JG Wentworth. When a company like Strava, where the data volume is massive, trusts you with their planning, you know the tech is robust. But here's why I really like them. Abacum doesn't turn you into a software admin. The integrations are actually self-service. You don't need a $300 an hour consultant to plug in your ERP or HRIS, and they're doing AI in a way that actually impacts the things FP&A teams are doing every day. Things like creating variance summaries, building formulas, and modeling scenarios. If you're scaling fast and you're trying to avoid that legacy platform trap, Abacum is the move. They're building the future of our tech stack, and they're doing it with a CFO's perspective. Go to abacum.ai to see it for yourself. That is abacum.ai. Well. Here's what nobody tells you about being a CFO. You'll spend 50% of your time on stuff that is killing your momentum. The best CFOs I know are business leaders who know how to drive growth in heroic fashion. But most of us end up spending our days buried in manual work. I'm talking about collecting receipts, reviewing expenses, and manually reconciling spend. It's painful. That's why CFOs need Brex. Brex built an intelligent finance platform that pairs corporate cards with built-in expense management, plus a team of AI agents to handle the manual finance tasks for you. That way, CFOs have more time for the high-impact projects that drive growth. You know, the shit actually worthy of your CFO time. Bottom line, Brex is automating hundreds of thousands of hours of manual finance work every month across 35,000 companies like Anthropic, Coinbase, and DoorDash. Ready to spend less time buried in expenses and more time driving results? Check out Brex at brex.com/metrics. It is brex.com/metrics. Please, guys. How the hell do I have 3 kids in daycare? Brex.com/metrics. Ken, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Ken, you've been a professional number 2 since your late 20s, and you've always been leveling up the game that you're playing. And you're a CFO and COO at a publicly traded tech company in Boston's backyard, and you're riding shotgun in the big leagues. What are some of the common patterns that you see from the number 2 vantage point that others might miss?
I think you have the advantage of when you are not the CEO, you can watch things from a perspective of you can learn, you can hear what's said, you can try to process that information. And sometimes you can replay it back to the CEO. Like, did you mean this or did you mean that? Or even after the meeting, say, what someone could have heard was something different than what you meant to. Many times you also have the advantage of kind of augmenting that information. So whether it be strategic, whether it be related to the culture or employees, you can kind of add some additional information. And so it's really a great position to be in where you can hear and synthesize it and actually try to make that message even better than it might come out the first time by the CEO. That really should be the role of anyone kind of in a number 2 or in a supporting executive role is to try to close gaps in the messaging.
And me and you were riffing on like the dynamic with your CEO when you're on an earnings call and you say, sometimes Alan will say something that inspires me or I'm just like, oh, that just clicked. And you'll draft off of that.
Our team is very diligent about putting together our scripts and preparing us with questions and what they think might come up. But the reality is both of us kind of do change. We get up in the morning and something comes to mind or something's topical. So even sometimes when I hear Alan reading the script as it was written, it might form an idea that I hadn't thought of when I heard the script 2 or 3 times before. So I'll grab a pen and I'll scratch out a paragraph and rewrite a sentence. And I know our compliance teams are a little nervous because they're like, oh my gosh, Ken's going to say something. I try to be thoughtful about, doing things that are less subject to like being wrong and more things that might just give some color to what's happening in the quarter or the future. So that becomes a really fun kind of back and forth between our CEO and myself.
It is a nice advantage, though, to be able to sit back and process what your CEO is saying, what investors may be saying, or whoever you could be meeting with, could be a channel partner, and processing it and saying, I can fill in some gaps because I have the full lay of the land and I'm able to download everything that people are communicating.
It is. And when I'm actually the lead communicator in a lot of our investor meetings, our head of investor relations will hear that the same way. And he'll come back normally afterwards and say, hey, you said this, but it would be interesting if you said it a little bit differently, you might hit that message. And even when we're on calls, he'll IM me sometimes and say, I don't know if you realize, but you said this sentence. I think you meant to say this. Because sometimes we say things and we misplace words, or we might actually say something that isn't actually what we meant to say. So it's really good to have someone else that kind of knows what you're trying to convey and can help to keep you on the right path of your messaging.
This wasn't on my call sheet around messaging, but it just struck me that I think there is an element of watching the game tape back, because you can always take what you said and then say, did people jump out of their seats at that? Did it go over their heads? Could I have packaged those words better?
One of the things that I think is really great about people on our team, our CEO, our head of investor relations, also lots of people from our management team will listen to my transcripts from the fireside chats at the different conferences. And they'll give me feedback like, hey, I really like the way you positioned this answer. Or, you said this, it sounded different than maybe the way you had positioned it. So when you get that feedback, it just helps make you better. It's staying on point. And that's hopefully what I can provide to our CEO from time to time, is to giving him that real-time feedback on how the strategy or the messaging might be heard versus what I believe may have been the intention.
Yeah, I know CFOs are far from stand-up comedians, at least most of them, but I do have to admire the craft that someone like a stand-up comedian has, where they're trying out this bit over and over again, just trying to get it right. I think it's important as a CFO and CEO to get your story down to that point, especially if you're embarking on a new part of your product roadmap or there's something going on macro-wise. You want to continue to work on those bits and those riffs.
Pega's been through a number of transformations and changes over the time that I've been here, and having the ability to kind of explain that message in a clear way. People joke with me all the time when I say, I'll make a suggestion on something and I'll say, listen, I'm not in marketing, and I'll get corrected many times by our marketing team, say, wait, no, you actually are really in marketing, because you have to really get the marketing message out on what our strategy is and why investors should be excited about what we're trying to accomplish.
Ken, being a professional number two, you have a lot of reps at managing up, I'm guessing, and communicating to the CEO and also to the board. Any tips for aspiring CFOs who are kind of riding shotgun and trying to figure out their voice in managing up?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things that executives don't do well, and you would expect that they would do it better, is they aren't always good at reading the room. They're not good at understanding, like, what is the question behind the question? What is the dynamic of what's going on in a room? Because it's not always the words that are being said. They have different motivations. They have different insecurities. They have different objectives that they're trying to get across. And you can watch a conversation, and what's really happening in a room might be really nothing to do with the words that you hear. So I think it's really an art, I think, that I've developed over a number of decades to really listen hard to what is going on, to understand the context of where people are coming from, and then to help get the conversation to the right place, like where people aren't talking by each other with maybe different initiatives. So that is a tricky thing, because you have to be careful that you're not just randomly guessing at what's going on. You have to be confident that you do know. And that's where that, did you mean this? Or let me repeat what I think you meant by that. Or here's what I think's behind your question. Those are helpful clarifications that you can get some affirmation that that's what they meant.
Do you think you've ever read the room wrong earlier in your career, or maybe flew too close to the sun?
I had a really career-altering moment once a few jobs ago where it was a leadership meeting. There was about 50 people in the room, and one of the senior executives made a really bold statement, and I thought he was wrong, and I aggressively kind of went after that. I'm not proud to say, maybe even a little bit overly aggressive. And the feedback I got after the meeting really helped give me, like, listen, you put him on the defensive. You made him feel defensive. You didn't really ask, like, what was behind that question. When I actually went and talked to him afterwards, had I done that, I think I may have seen like it through his eyes versus my immediate reaction, which was to think he was trying to deflect accountability. And really what it was that he had a different motivation of what he was trying to accomplish. And that didn't reconcile with what, we were asking him to do from a strategic standpoint. So yeah, we all drop the ball at times. I think the important part is to know that'll happen and try to learn from it and try to minimize the chance you drop it the next time.
I'm having a visceral reaction thinking of a time that I did the same thing with a technical leader, and I was way too aggressive in my approach. And part of it was the passion of me wanting to get it right. But honestly, I think it came across as anger, and that was just not the right way to treat somebody in the moment.
Anger is not one of my bad qualities, but I am aggressive in my communication and I have a lot of confidence in what I think I know, and that can trip you up sometimes. It's good to be humbled at times, right? Because it kind of sets you back a little to realize we don't know everything, and our experiences when we do kind of screw up, as you mentioned and I mentioned, learn from that. And that's the biggest thing. Like when you become a CFO for the first time, you feel like, okay, I can't screw this up. I got to be perfect. And that can make you either be really apprehensive to make decisions or it can make you feel like you need to always have an answer for something. And both of those are bad traits. So like you kind of have to feel your way through it.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. You just launched a new AI product. The new pricing page looks great. I'm talking crisp. But behind it, last-minute glued code, messy spreadsheets, and running ad hoc queries to figure out what to bill. Customers get invoices they can't understand. Engineers are chasing billing bugs. Finance can't close the books. Well, with Metronome, you hand it all off to the real-time billing infrastructure that just works. Reliable, flexible, and built to grow with you. They turn raw usage events into accurate invoices, give customers bills they actually understand, and keep every team in sync in real time. Whether you're launching usage-based pricing, managing enterprise contracts, or rolling out new AI services, Metronome does the heavy lifting so you can focus on your product, not your billing. That's why some of the fastest growing companies in the world like OpenAI and Anthropic run their billing on Metronome. Visit metronome.com to learn more. That's metronome.com. Here's a growth tax nobody talks about. Every new monetization model you ship creates a nightmare for your finance team. Add usage-based pricing? Now you're tracking consumption against commitments. Launch product bundles? That's multiple performance obligations per contract. Offer mid-cycle upgrades? Woo! Good luck reallocating revenue manually. The irony is brutal. The pricing innovations that drive growth are the same ones that often break your finance process. But that's exactly where RightRev shines. RightRev is the revenue recognition engine built for companies that can't afford to let accounting slow down growth. Here's what most people miss, and I've come to deeply appreciate. Revenue recognition isn't just a finance problem. It's a go-to-market enabler. When your rev rec is automated, your product team can ship new pricing without asking finance for permission. And your sales team can close creative deals without worrying about downstream chaos. To get up on my CFO soapbox for a sec, I love talking about creative pricing models, hybrid pricing, credits, tiered usage. It's where real growth happens. But I've seen too many companies where the sales team is celebrating a huge quarter while finance is still trying to figure out how to recognize half of it and crying in the corner. RightRev lets you experiment with pricing without wrecking your close process. And honestly, in a world where your pricing model might change 3 times next year, that flexibility is everything. If you want to scale your monetization without breaking your books, visit RightRev.com. That's RightRev.com, where modern monetization meets bulletproof accounting. Being a CFO, you know how much I love tools that actually make the lives of accounting and finance folks easier. One of my favorite tools right now is Rillet, the AI-native ERP going head-to-head with NetSuite. Yes, someone is finally doing it. I met Rillet 2 years ago when they were still in stealth. Since then, they've absolutely taken the finance world by storm. Their mission is to make the zero-day close a reality, and they're actually doing it. Customers are literally closing their books at 1:35 p.m. on the first day of the month. They've got everything you need to scale your business. Complex revenue recognition, native integrations, custom reporting, multi-entity, close management, and much more. They're only a few years in and are already supporting NASDAQ publicly listed companies. Yes, seriously. If you want to scale your business on an ERP that wasn't built in the 90s, you need to check out Rillet. Book a demo at rillet.com/CJ. Oh, cool. That's me. That's RILLET.com/CJ. RILLET.com/CJ. Tell him I sent you there. Well, Ken, let's stay on communication style for a second, because I read something on your email style. Now, people are like, CJ, you're picking out a nit here, but I thought this was super fascinating because you said, my general rule is if you really have to closely proofread the email, then maybe it's just better to pick up the phone instead. I think there's a golden nugget in there. Can you unpack it for us?
I like to be in the habit of closing out the communication. So not if someone asks you kind of a subtle question like, my game plan is to do A or B, does that sound right? The answer just is yes. But if the answer is kind of, but also you should consider, if you start to get into that where you're putting together lots of thoughts, what's going to happen is you're going to have a back and forth. You're going to send that, the other person's going to go back. So I have learned from some of the people that I've worked with that, especially with the way we can communicate through chat and other vehicles, it's probably even more so less on the phone and more on like a WebEx or a Zoom or a Teams chat, is just to jump on and say, let's talk for 5 minutes, because I think it'll save us both sending 10 emails back and forth. And it also save a misunderstanding of the email. I've actually found emails where I've sent one. Sometimes you might send it to a group of people. Now you've just cluttered a group of people's emails, right? And they're going to all want to communicate. But I've found sometimes where I've sent an email and I've seen the outcome of what the person did. And I went back and read the email. And you may see these funny things where you put a period somewhere or a comma and it changes the entire statement. That happens very easily. Like you're typing quick. It's almost like I type like I text, right? Emojis, short words, etc. But if you're trying to explain a deeper concept, email is not really the best communication. I think it's much more to get on the phone with someone. And that's really a preference for me.
It's sage advice, because once you start to veer into, well, it depends territory, that's probably your cue to say, rather than trying to type a decision tree, I should just call them.
Yeah. And they're going to come back, right? Of course, they're going to come back. If I send something to you, you'd say, well, okay, then let me throw back another idea. And then what happens if they took themselves further off base? Then at some point, you're going to have to come back and calibrate. So why not just do it on the front end?
Yeah. The further I've gotten in my career, the more I've also realized that if you're in the CFO seat and you send an email, many times you're also inviting an email back that you will have to respond to, because you cast something out there and they feel a responsibility to get back to you. So it's managing how many volleys you put out there, because it does create work and communication for you to deal with.
And another thing that happens, I'm sure you've seen this, CJ, is when an executive sends an email to either a person or a group of people, they tend to want to forward that email to other people. And then so now your message could get diluted, where people may not know the context. They have to read through the whole series of emails. So if you have to get a message across, get the relevant people together, have a quick conversation, figure out where the misalignment is, and you save yourself a lot of headaches.
Well, I know you're big on first principles and tying everything back to the business goals. When you communicate the business goals, Ken, do you change how you go about it, and maybe the tone or the structure of how you do it, depending on if you're talking to, say, sales versus engineering?
There's a joke that a colleague of mine said to me once. He said, if the goal is world peace, you have to talk to different constituents different about how they accomplish that, right? How you talk to a military organization versus how you talk to a charitable organization, how you talk to a political organization are very different about how they can contribute to that outcome. The first thing I always think about is, who is the audience and what are they motivated on? How do they view success and how do they view failure, and where might their insecurities be around their contribution? So then I try to take that strategy or that message and try to make it relevant for that audience. Why would they care? It's kind of the why me, why now? So I think if you get into that why me piece, it's like, well, I'm sales, I'm product, I'm finance, I'm a customer. Like, how do those things fit and how are they relevant? And it's just, I've found that one message does not resonate well across all those different constituents.
The why me part, it's so human. You have to tie it back to what it means for that person in their role. Is this going to help them do their job faster? Is it going to help them get paid more? Is it going to help them get promoted? Inherently, people are selfish to a certain degree.
Maybe a different way to frame that is, people are inherently trying to preserve their place in the greater good, right? And so if their place is to grow customers, they're going to be thinking about the obstacles and what they need to have to be able to do that. And if you come in and say, we're going to actually reduce our spend in R&D and just say that because we want to be more efficient, a sales team might say, well, then I'm not going to have the best innovation. If I coupled that with so that we can spend more money on lead generation and marketing, et cetera, they might say, oh, now I see the connection between that decision. If you went to a product team and said, I'd like to reduce my spend in innovation, the product team might say, that's going to hurt my career. I'm not going to be able to hire as many people. But you might say, and what that can do for us is it's going to accelerate our growth, which is going to open up more investment, which means we can maybe then pick the next adjacent area of technology innovation. They might say, oh, I see what's in that for me. So that's how one comment can actually be viewed very negatively by a group, but also could be turned around to be positive and they could see their place in the bigger picture.
Man, now we're cooking. That was such a good example. Ken, you've talked about being careful as a CFO and a culture leader at Pega not to let leaders stray from the company's value system. What does that vigilance actually look like in practice?
And this is hard because there are behaviors and there are values, and they're not always the same. And so you can have people that really do have a good value system, but they don't know how to properly, in a healthy way, behave to demonstrate those values. So an example could be someone is really ethical. They're very honest. They have a great center of like right and wrong. But if their behaviors are that they belittle people and yell at people and humiliate people, to what does that really serve the purpose? You turn people off. So for me, it's a combination of values and behaviors. I think you've got to have, there are core values. At Pega, we have a set of core values, not the least of which is really being curious. We want people to care. We want people that want to learn, that want to be curious. And then there's behaviors, like how do you create a world of encouragement around others that might not be natural. Not everybody loves to learn. Not everybody is naturally curious. Not everybody maybe is comfortable with ambiguity. So you kind of figure out like, how do you encourage the value system and how do you embrace like certain behaviors? For me, it's about building relationships with people before you have to have a conversation about values and behaviors so that then you can have a very direct conversation. If you and I don't know each other at all and we try to talk about behaviors or values, it's much more of a defensive relationship between us versus if we already have a relationship, we respect like what our roles are in the company, it's much easier to bring up a hard situation and say, I don't think we met our goal as a company around our behaviors and values. In this instance, I think you can reduce the temperature a little. I mean, it's still delicate, but I think it can be done.
I love how you separated the two because to many, it may be synonymous that behaviors and values are kind of one and the same, but they may feel one way and act another.
Our values are, in my opinion, they're very core to like who we are as a person and what matters to us. Our behaviors are what we learned will execute to get the outcome that we want. So they're certainly related, but they're very different. Like you can train someone to behave in a certain way. Think about the military. The military has a very structured way of behaving. That does not mean that everybody's values are exactly the same, but their behaviors are pretty disciplined and consistent across. I mean, I think at least my experience of having family members in the military, they have a very consistent way of behaving, very disciplined behavior, but their values might be very different.
Well, Ken, one of the reasons why I was so excited to have you on is I've been following Pega's journey and you've gone through a number of transformations. And something that caught my eye was you said that big transformations need to be followed by a period of anchoring. Can you unpack that for us?
A very sage leader that I worked with in my career, mentioned that most human beings cannot deal with perpetual change. Some can, they're a very small percentage, but just the constant change, it's fatiguing and it's hard to keep focused. So when you go through big periods of change, I think it's important to kind of stabilize things and anchor and show that that change has actually been kind of embedded in the operations or the culture of the business. It's good for the majority of employees to see that, like, we're going to run really hard and we're going to like see that stabilize and anchor, and then we're going to go after the next hill. And I do think that change anchoring allows you to get more done over longer periods of time, as opposed to constant change for 2 or 3 or 4 years. I think you'll have a lot of people check out. They just will not be able to handle that. And I think you might think as a leader that you're really like, we'll get more done if we just go perpetual change for 3 years, you actually will not, because people become less efficient. They'll check out. They'll be unengaged. That's been something that someone brought up to me decades ago. You want the periods of change to be as long as possible, get as much done, and the anchoring to be as short as possible. So you have to kind of balance that. But I've seen it work really well.
Sometimes those changes in the investment you made, it may not sink in if you don't pause.
Sometimes they'll say you need to hear things 7 times before it sinks in. I don't know if that's true or not, but you certainly can benefit from people hearing it a few times, getting a chance to process it, ask questions, to really personalize that change to themselves, and actually then get to execute in the new world of what that change means in some safer space, so to speak, so that then they're ready for the next hill.
Yeah, I remember speaking to a person I used to work with. I think at the time I was getting married or something like that. You should try not to make too many changes at once. Like, it's a bad idea to move from where you live, change jobs, and say also have a baby all at the same time. Like, you're not going to be able to process all those changes at once.
I mean, those are real life examples that we could probably, many of us can relate to. I mean, that's a lot of stress. One of my relatives said to me was, if you get married, move, and have a child all in a year, like that really will prove if your marriage can last. But is that really the risk you have to take? Like in business, you might want to pace those changes. But I do think you're right to think like all that change at once, it can break things. And the purpose of change is not to break things intentionally. It's to try to be better on the other side. So just figuring out what's right for your org, and it's a situational thing. There's not a perfect answer for every situation.
Can you take me through a period of change in a situation that Pega went through, and then you said, hey, we got to let this sink in for a while before sprinting to the next hill?
When we first moved to the cloud, we first decided we wanted to move from being an on-premise software provider largely into being a cloud provider. We had to make some very important decisions about the pace in which we moved. Do we change the sales comp plan? How much do we give optionality to clients? Do we force clients to move to the cloud? What about our product roadmap? So we had to kind of thread a bunch of pieces together there. And the decision we made was to really be a little bit more thoughtful and calm about that shift. And knowing that we weren't probably going to move to the cloud all in 1 year or even all in 2 years, it was going to give us sustainability of that move. And customers were going to be appreciative of not putting that kind of big change on them as well. When we first started selling cloud, there were countries and our sales teams that said, we can't sell cloud here because we're a regulated industry or we're a country that doesn't really adopt with open arms. And so you had to kind of break down like disbelief, concern, fear. Then you had a technology change that was happening too. So that was a big change for us that I think we had to move as fast as we could, but also recognize that we had to move as fast as we were allowed to.
I know related to that, one of the big changes was shifting to ARR and ACV models from term license, as you mentioned. I'd imagine that meant rewiring how reps are compensated and how they think about their work. What did you find when you embarked on that journey?
Yeah, specifically the change that we made, which was we used to pay our salespeople on total contract value, which was the total dollars committed by a client. And we said, that's less important to us than the actual annual amount that the client is going to be committed to us. When we made that change, we had to go and help explain to our sales teams why we were making that change. Some of them may have understood it instinctively because they may have came from another company that did something similar, but many were at Pega for a number of years. That was a big change. So we had to first explain the why. Then we had to figure out what's the equivalent amount of annual. Then we had to change the comp plan and the quotas and the rates and think about the accelerators. That's just with one group. And so in order to go through that change, you had to put yourself in a salesperson's shoes. First, they've got to talk to clients about it. Second, they've got to understand how it impacts them. They're very competitive and they have quotas. So they believe they can measure their performance by how much they get paid based on that output. So that was like the tip of the spear, so to speak. We then had to go into our product teams and our operations teams and start to talk about what do they need to do to make sure that they're keeping up with this shift, because the client model is different. Expectations of the client is different. And how do we think about measurement of value in that model is different. So there were a lot of pieces that, now looking back seem very obvious, but as we were going through it, we could have broken any of those. That would have not been great for our business if we did that.
We talk about compensating sales reps all the time on the podcast. Something I don't think I spend enough time on is how you communicate those changes to the customers, because it becomes a game of telephone that you have to get right. You have to educate the salespeople so then they can talk in an educated way to the customer so they get the full value.
One of the worst things that can happen with a sales team to a customer, and I've seen it happen at companies that I've worked at over my career, is where the salesperson does not understand why the change is happening. And remember that the salesperson has just as deep a relationship with the customer as they do with the company. They work for the company, but the customer is how they make their living. So they will be very honest with the customer. And there are comments I've heard like, I don't know why the company's doing this. I agree with you. It seems like this is unfair to you. So when you have situations like that, it's really catastrophic for the customer understanding. They immediately say, well, geez, if the salesperson, if their own employees don't understand why this is being done, either this is a really silly decision or the company's trying to hurt me in some way. That is very easy for someone to think that that's what's happening. So it's really important that the salesperson pressure test. I really love the feedback, and I hope our sales leaders always know that I want the feedback. Like, I don't know why this plan doesn't make sense. Here's the unintended consequence that you're going to get. Or explain this more so I can explain to my teams. I love when I have those conversations with sales leaders, because either I figure out maybe there is something wrong in our comp plans, or they come out of it saying, now I understand what we're trying to accomplish. I can actually make sure our teams understand. If we don't do that on the front end, you end up with the salesperson saying to the customer, yeah, I don't know why, this is stupid. I don't know why the company's doing this. That's a bad outcome.
Ken, that was gold. I never thought about it that way, that the sales rep is actually maybe even, you could say, even more loyal to the customer in that sense, if you were to look at the dynamic, because that's how they end up making their money at the end of the day. They may be on your payroll, but they have an extremely close relationship with the customer because that's the path by which they get rewarded.
I've actually had salespeople, friends of mine, and even ones that I've worked with that said, listen, I can work for any company and I can sell any product, but at the end of the day, my trust with this customer is how I'm going to be able to sell that product. So, I mean, that's the reality of certainly enterprise sellers. We want our salespeople to have good relationships with customers. A lot of CFOs specifically, but even some CEOs, they get stuck on like economics so hard that they like lose track of what might be the downside of that. So they kind of do the math. They say, well, if I increase quotas and cut the commission rate and increase prices to customers, I'll get more revenue and I'll be more efficient. What will happen? Customers might churn. Salespeople might feel like they can't achieve their quota and they'll leave. They might feel like the company's being unfair. What I've seen with my peers, even, and friends of mine, colleagues, is they kind of miss the bigger picture of that change that might look good from a financial standpoint, but might be actually quite devastating to the trust with our field teams.
Well, I want to tap into that because you seem like you're pretty open to sales reps and sales leaders giving you feedback on what they're seeing out in the field and how plans work. Can you talk about how you balance basically your whole view of the P&L and where the company is going, and then the anecdotes that come from the field and how comp plans are working?
First, I think it's really important to build an environment where the sales teams feel like they can come and talk to you, and they feel like you'll be fair. Like they feel like that you'll be objective and fair. With that, there are going to be requests that are not as credible, that might be more biased to their own territory, might not really make sense for the company. You've got to try to come off as understanding where they're coming from, but also giving them direct feedback. We can't do that because of X. We can't do that because of Y. We could do that. Good suggestion. And here's how we would do it. And almost showing them that like you understand where they're coming from and you're recognizing really good arguments that field teams make. I mean, field teams understand the comp plans and how it will work much better than the operations teams because they see it in real life. They can see how their own behaviors will actually change. But they also will sometimes be biased by their own compensation plans. So you've got to call them out on that when that happens. And I think if you can build that relationship, I've even had sales leaders that will, if I will say like, I don't really think that's, a fair way that you're looking at it, I've actually had feedback from sales leaders kind of laugh and go, yeah, you're right. That's probably not a fair ask because they know you're kind of on their team. Probably the most important theme is we are on the same team. If a sales team believes executives are right there with them, you're probably going to have a much better chance with managing change with the sales teams.
Well, speaking of managing change, you went through a period at Pega where you were actually de-emphasizing the new logo growth so you could concentrate on increasing the install base. And I believe that went along with some of the other changes that were going on at the company. How did you communicate and how did you navigate that?
We really wanted to transform the way our sales team was organized. So what we had fallen into was a trap of having too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, in the selling. We had an account executive, we had sometimes product specialists, we had sales engineers that might be product horizontal or vertically focused, we had partners. We ended up with a very costly model, and we weren't getting the outcome that we hoped to get. So we had to fix that. We had to address that. But we had to slow down our focus on new logos because if we tried to do that at the same time, we felt like we might not do one. It's a little bit of the change in anchoring. That was only for 1 year. So it was about 15 months actually, but we had to really say, look, we're going to focus less on new logos. We're going to really focus hard on this transformation. When we get to the other side, we certainly will start entertaining new logos. I think our sales team understood that well and executed very well through that. I think investors were much more suspect. I think that was a tricky messaging because an investor could hear from that, Pega can't sell to anybody new, and therefore their market is very much just focused on who they already sold to, which is not true, but you could see how that might be the message that they get. So I had to just really focus people on first A, then B. We have to get the sales organization aligned to the structure that we want, and then we'll be able to open up to new logos. And now we're a few years after that, and we are attacking new logos much more aggressively now.
And it all plays out in the metrics. But at the same time, do you think we as CFOs can over-rotate or over-obsess on KPIs?
I'm certain that I do it myself. I'm very much watching for in the organization where KPIs are created just to have a KPI. You may not even know what the KPI should be, or you might make one up. Now, I'm fine with directional KPIs. Like, I don't know what I need it to be, but I want to at least see movement in that direction. So that is totally fine. Like, it's 30 degrees outside. I want it to be 40. I want it to be 50. I want it to be something more than 30. That's a direction. But for you to say, in 12 months, I want to move the temperature from 30 degrees to 46.7 degrees. And if we don't well, where did you come up with that number? Probably that number was made up. Now, KPIs where you have patterns and history and you have very good predictability and you know exactly what the levers are, like your gross margin on one of your product lines, that's different. Like that's where KPIs really need to be hard-coded into your DNA.
Ken, why do you think we over-measure? Because I do it myself. Is it just human nature? We want to latch onto something to feel like we understand it?
You know, it might go back to like what we learned in college, right? I mean, think about all the data analysis and data modeling and statistics and, you know, micro and macro and money supply and all these formulas. So I think we get comfort as CFOs in numbers. That's actually what makes us powerful to help the organization. It's also an Achilles heel at times, right? Because you forget that there are people and products and competitors and things that are not actually in the numbers that can disrupt you. For me, I think maybe it just comes from like how much we're indoctrinated into the value of numbers through our education.
And there are different ways that we view those numbers, whether you're in the private space and private equity backed or a public company CFO. I wanted to switch gears to talk about, you know, sitting in each of those seats, because you've said that private equity thrives partly because public execs aren't wired or maybe they're not incentivized to run lean and focused businesses. I'm hoping you could unpack that for us.
These are one of those things that I don't like calling out a problem that I don't really have an idea how to solve. But this is in that category.
It's an observation. Yeah.
Public companies have a motivation system that at times can either do one of two things. Either have you swing for the fences, not realizing that what would happen if you miss, or allowing some level of normalcy can still be fine. And so like not really making much change, not really improving, you still make millions of dollars in executive compensation, even when shareholders do not. And then the other side is there's an outsized risk taking where executives feel like I've got to really swing for the fences. And if I do, I'm going to become incredibly wealthy. And if I don't, well, then I'll just try at the next company. And I think that is unfortunately part of the public company DNA more than we might want to acknowledge. I actually think Pega's kind of in the middle of that. We always have to hold ourselves accountable to driving shareholder value over long periods of time. But when you have a founder that has such a significant equity presence in a company like we do, you end up really thinking like you own the company more, right? You think about the long term. You don't think about just short periods of time. That's a little bit the way that I think the advantage of private equity can be, is that private equity can come in and say, I'm going to really push hard for the next 3 to 4 to 5 years, whatever that holding period is. And we're going to have a value creation plan. And here are the things we want to improve. And everybody on the team, including the management team, is incented to make that transformation. Now, the negative on the private equity side is it's typically to get to an event and then someone else has to continue it on. The public markets, it's typically, there's not as much of a motivation to do that big value creation. So neither model is necessarily perfect, but I do think many times private equity plays an important role of a curation of maybe inefficient business practices, right? Because the one thing private equity does well is they're very good at kind of benchmarks and best practices and pushing companies to get to the right playing weight.
And just reflecting on it live, I'm trying to figure out if it's more a problem on compensation or if it's more a problem on having a timeline. Because if you think about the public markets, executives are compensated in a way that's more liquid with stock that can trade. They have to disclose it, but they can cash in on that. You're playing the game to play forever, hopefully, and stay public. Whereas on the private side, there is a defined, hold period. Most of the time, we have all these continuation funds now, but you do have to think that there's a defined hold period, and then your stock is a liquid. Everybody kind of cashes out at the same time. So I can't really decide if it's a combination of those problems or one of them more specifically.
If you focus just on the problem of why can companies be more valuable in the hands of a private equity owner, I think that problem is a problem of motivation. I actually think the private equity teams are motivated to make the change fast because then all people win in that hold period, versus the public markets can be perceived as more patient, right? Can be perceived as more long-term, which doesn't have as much of a near-term motivation. So I just think it's the compensation tied to the near-term performance. And that's why I think some companies where investors may say, I'm not willing to wait 5 years or 10 years to get the realization of value. I'd rather get it now by selling it to a private equity-based firm that will pay a premium over where the stock is trading. Like I said, I think you're right. I don't know if there's a right or a wrong model, but specifically, I do think why more companies go private is because they're not held to a standard that we should be held to as executives. I use Rule of 40 as I know you're aware, because it's not that 40 is the magic number. It's just you have to balance growth and profit, and you have to hold yourself accountable to run a good business. We're too tolerant of companies not running a good business in the public markets, and that I do think is a problem.
So I was looking the other day, and the number of publicly traded companies in 2000 was just under 8,000. Now we're below 4,000. There are less public companies out there. You wonder why.
The interesting thing is the amount of companies that have went private and then reemerged as a public company are rapidly increasing. Most companies of size come back out as a public company again after they get cleaned up.
Ken, you yourself went from a private equity-backed CFO. You were part of the Dynatrace spin-out, and then you stepped over to the public side in a big way. How did you have to evolve your mindset around being a CFO, going from the private sphere to the public sphere?
There's a few differences, but I think one of the biggest differences is that your stakeholder base of investors are not aligned with what they want from the company in the public markets, and they're not as educated. So you have to work really hard to form your strategy, to educate them, and to understand that some investors, they want you to do acquisitions, and other investors would rather that you buy back stock, and other investors would rather that you increase cash flow margin, and others would rather that you not grow faster. Investors have different strategies. That doesn't mean they know what's best for your business. In the private markets, there's very tight alignment. There's an alignment between the investment team, between the operating partners, between the management team. There's hurdles that need to happen for vesting. There's an exit plan. So I think there's much better alignment. So that's one big difference of when you get into the public markets, you need to communicate the strategy to people that don't really understand what you do to the extent that you might hope they do. And those investors change all the time. I've been a public company CFO for about 10 years. I started to go to investor conferences about 10 years ago. And if I think about the number of people that I recognize in those conferences, although there are a lot of them, there's way more new people coming to those conferences every year. So it's a constant recirculation of new people. There's new people coming in all the time. And so they don't know who you are, and you have to kind of work on that. That's the big difference, I think, between private and public, is that external messaging of your strategy.
Wow, this gives me a lot to think about. Because there are new faces, new investors, even retail investors, can you still go as deep on the story, or is it just you have to repeat yourself so many times?
Many times you'll sit down with an investor and they will start by asking questions that they've heard from 5 other companies that they've talked to, or a bank, or a sell-side analyst, or some article that they read. And sometimes it's very accurate, and sometimes it's just off. And you can't change your strategy, but you have to do is put your strategy in the context of where their mindset is. You have to meet them where they are, I think is the right way to say it.
Like you said, you've been at Pega for almost a decade now. If you look back, what is one decision you think you made that you were nervous about making at that time, but really played out well?
I think the biggest one was our movement to move into the cloud. When we made a decision to become a subscription business, which is a recurring business from perpetual, we made a very quick follow-on decision to go hard into Pega Cloud. Our technology was certainly best in class, but we did not have a scale of operating at the cloud at that time. We were kind of instrumenting a lot of the pieces of that 10 years ago. I spent a lot of time trying to think about what could go wrong, and how do we mitigate that, and how fast should we move, and how do we motivate. And I talked to clients, I talked to salespeople. So that was a point of higher stress for me in terms of making sure we got it right.
Well, I imagine it's stressful too, because you're making a decision where the feedback loop is very long. It's not like you wake up the next morning, you're like, yes, we nailed it.
That's a great point. And there's another point that's not in the feedback loop, which is what's happening in the market outside of Pega that's going to change what you may have written down. The best form strategies can get thrown out as soon as they start to be executed because of something that happens in the market. We all know that from COVID, right? Like, things change. Where we are now, it's like, it's been amazing the progress we've made. I'm glad we did it, but it was scary in those early years.
Ken, I'm going to take you into what we call our long ass lightning round. So the first question I ask to every successful exec is, can you give us something that you've messed up on the job before? Could be this role or a previous role.
My communication style and missing the mark on not thinking about where the other person was coming from. I still do that today, so it's something you always need to work on. I'm much better now than I was earlier in my career, so I've screwed that up a lot.
If you could tell your younger self something knowing what you know today, what would you tell them?
Relationships and learning are the foundation of a long career.
If you look back at how you've put time to networking is a funny thing, right? You need it after you realize it. Do you think that you've put enough time into networking relationships early in your career, later in your career? And how do you make time for it?
I did not spend as much time earlier in my career. I thought that just my sheer hard work and effort would actually be fine. I think when I hit about 40 years old, I started to realize that there were a lot of people out there that needed my help and a lot that I could learn from. You can always pay things forward. And I felt like if I did that, it would work out. And it has worked out great. Like the relationships I built through 3rd and 4th degree connection points of people saying, hey, I knew you from X and I want to introduce you to Y. And then that ends up being a fruitful relationship. The way I landed at Pega was actually a result of that. The way I landed at Pega was a former CEO that I worked for, Jim Heppelman, who was at PTC, actually called me one day and said, hey, I know Alan Trefler and he's looking for a CFO. That same day, Spencer Stewart called me about the search. Jim had talked to Alan. I had met Alan through Spencer Stewart. When I left PTC, I didn't piss anybody off, right? I kept my relationships
You couldn't have drawn that up, right?
You never know. Sometimes it works out. Most of the time it doesn't work out, which is why people don't spend time on it, because there's not an immediate payback.
More of a technical one. Can you walk me through your software finance stack? What tools does your team use to get the job done?
we run on SAP. Many of the processes that we have around SAP, we use Pega workflow. Pega sells a lot of workflow solutions like quote to cash, procure to pay, et cetera, around the ERP system. So it's a core part of what we do. So we've got SAP, we've got Pega as a hard foundation around SAP, which, we think we're, best in class. And then we use, Ariba for payroll processing. We use Concur for expense management, et cetera. So we try to connect to the SAP stack and really Pega around it.
Pega on Pega. That makes sense. Last one I got for you. What's the craziest thing you've ever had someone try to expense?
I had someone expense sitting at an oxygen bar during our Pega World event. Someone may have got hungover, and so they tried to go to an oxygen bar. But when I looked at the timing of the receipts, it was during the keynote session by our CEO. That's where I really had to draw the line. And they said, oh, no, but I had the laptop up and we were watching it. I said, I'm sorry. That's not acceptable behavior for us at Pega. So it was only $79, but somehow that actually got to my view. I don't remember how, but that was a real silly one.
Poor timing. Wow.
Yeah.
Ken, this has been an absolute blast. Thank you for carving out time for us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. That was fun.
Run the Numbers is a mostly media production. Yelling and intro by Fat Joe. Artwork by Meg D'Alessandro. Show is executive produced by Ben Hillman. Nothing said on this podcast is intended to be business or investment advice. It's the sole opinion of me, a guy who feeds his dog way too much ice cream and has a history of net operating losses. LOL. If you like this podcast, hit subscribe and give us 5 stars. It will take like 2 seconds and our algorithm overlords love it. Drink water, call your mom, and have a great day. Peace.